Welcome to the Lily Pod, Catapult Greater Pittsburgh's podcast where we discuss all things politics, community, and people. It's season 3. Can you believe it? Season 3, episode 1. And do we have an incredible episode for you today? Today, we are honored to have our friend and colleague and partner in this social justice work, Michelle McMurray, who is the VP of Program and Community Engagement at the Pittsburgh Foundation. Michelle, thank you so much for making time. I know how busy you are. I know how tough it is to get out of the office and come and make time for these types of things. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate and how much I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, and nobody is busier than you. So we're in good company.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. I'm glad that we both were able to make time for this conversation because I think it's a good one. It's a timely one. But, you know, it's interesting as in Pittsburgh is you were one of the first Black women that I knew working in philanthropy. Always just assumed, just maybe just based on my experiences and my background, that I just assumed that philanthropy was a white job, right? It was a job. I had never met people who looked like me in philanthropy. You and Carmen Anderson at the Heinz Endowments were two of the first women I knew working in philanthropy. And it also did something. It was like, oh, maybe I could do that one day, And I always still think, well, I'm still young. I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do in life. And this is one of the things that I think is very interesting. And I want to talk about your work. But first, I want to talk about you. I want to talk about you because I just think that you're just an incredible woman. I think Pittsburgh is very, very blessed to have you. And definitely those of us that work in the nonprofit sector, we know how valuable you are as a human being, but also your place in philanthropy is important. I think that you have used your voice in a way that many people are afraid to. I think you've used your voice and your experiences in a way that have helped shape some of the philanthropic efforts at the Pittsburgh Foundation. So it takes a special person to be able to walk into those doors and try to advocate for equity in this system. So who is Michelle McMurray? Where are you from? Are you from Pittsburgh? Did you start here? Where are you from?
Well, first, thank you for the kind words. It means a lot coming from you. So who am I? So I am Vera Thomas's daughter. And if anyone wants to know anything about me, it starts with knowing who my mom is. I'm not from here. My mom was actually born in Fayette County, so, like 40 minutes up the road, but moved to a little place called Fairmont, West Virginia.
I know it well.
When she met my father.
I'm a West Virginia girl as well.
See, good things come out of West Virginia. And it was there that I think my mother... where she raised me, mostly, as a single mom, where I got to watch her every day show up. She's actually the first philanthropist that I've ever known. And I think to your point, a lot of people think about philanthropy through a very Eurocentric lens of it is people who have a lot of money, who have a lot of power or privilege, who then extend their charity to others who are less fortunate. But in my community where I grew up, philanthropy happened every day. And it happened in my household. My mom was an avid tither. So I come from a very spiritual family, very religious family. The church that I grew up in was very close-knit. Town is small, so everybody basically...
Yeah, everybody knew everybody.
Especially if you were Black. Weren't a whole lot of us there. And so I watched my mother tithe into that church every Sunday. And it didn't matter if she had a lot or a little, but she gave from what she had because she believed in what could happen if collectively we all gave toward that community. And so I watched that kind of philanthropy. I watched her give her time. She volunteered. She was the superintendent at a Sunday school.
Aw.
She started an initiative called Teen Summit that brought youth together on a regular basis to just pour into them, and brought other adults to understand the value of the youth that were in our church. And then sometimes she also brought people into our home. You know, if I have friends who were struggling with something, or sometimes it was, you know, a relative who needed, they came into our home. And it didn't mean that we had a lot, but she always felt like there was enough for everybody.
Now, see, that is something that I've been doing a lot of lately, is language, and trying to, I'm actually wondering if a lot of times we have different definitions for words that people use a lot. What is your definition of philanthropy? Because I think you've made a really good point, and I think I want our listeners to think about this word in a different way, because you're absolutely right. I had this Eurocentric idea of philanthropy when I came into this work. In my mind, it was rich funder, people with funding, endowments, people, you know, who earned or who were the benefit or legacy of a large amount of money and made decisions about who would get. And that's just the picture that I had in my mind. But you're making a very strong point that I think is important for people to understand. Philanthropy does not mean giving hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, right? I think using philanthropy in terms of thinking about tithing is very important. I think anyone who is invested in religion and is benefiting from the houses of religion should be consistently giving to keep those things going. That is a form of philanthropy.
Yeah.
Right? Your neighbor needs help. We did a lot of this. So we always talked about social capital, right? We talk about social capital a lot. And social capital is typically used in terms of, well, someone of means or someone with opportunities that I don't have access to, opening doors for entrance into those opportunities. That is a great form of social capital. But so is the mom, you know, who is able to lend to her neighbor something to make a meal for her children until she's able to.
Absolutely.
Right. Or the grandma or the elder on the street who agrees to make breakfast sandwiches for the kids at the bus stop in the morning. These are forms of philanthropy that I think do not hold the value for people. People don't understand that the value of that type of philanthropy, how special it is and how important it is for our community. So thank you for that's a great distinction, and I love thinking about philanthropy on a community level.
Yeah, I mean, so at its basic, you know, philanthropy comes from, you know, the Greek root of the word philanthropy just means love of humanity.
Oh God, I love that.
It just means love of humanity.
Did y'all hear that? Love of humanity. Look how simple that is.
Love of humanity.
Yeah.
And so what are all the ways that somebody might demonstrate that love of humanity? So, you know, in the circles in philanthropy that I'm in, particularly when we talk about the Black community, we talk about time, talent, testimony, tithes, and then treasure, right? So there are all kinds of ways that people can give of themselves and of what they have to demonstrate that basic love of humanity. And it happens every single day. It's just that when it happens in Black communities, you know, Latino communities or immigrant refugee communities, it's not called philanthropy.
Right.
But it absolutely is.
100%.
And I think our communities, without that, oftentimes that is what has sustained blocks, neighborhoods, communities, has been the people who live, work, worship, and play in those neighborhoods deciding that they're going to love on one another.
Yeah, we
with
need so
whatever
much
they have.
more of that right now. We need that. I mean, when it comes down to it, we must find a way to step outside of this individualistic idea that a lot of us are in right now, right? I'm going to worry about me and mine. I'm worried about me and mine, which guess what? You absolutely have to worry about you and yours. And we absolutely have to think about ourselves first, right? You cannot pour. We hear that all the time.
Yeah.
It's so cliche at this point. But you can't pour from an empty cup, which means that you have to make sure you're stable enough to give, and to give of your time, and to give of your money, and to give of your resources. You have to be strong and stable enough to do that. I think I want to hit on this really quick because I've been thinking about this, right? I've heard people judging leaders in the nonprofit sector or in the community sector based on what kind of car they drive. And if they're driving a really nice car, I've heard people use that as sort of a way to devalue that person's work in the community. And it struck me. Now, my car is about 20 years old, so it ain't me. But but if it were me, if I did decide to go buy a new car that I've always wanted, why would I be judged as someone doing this work because people believe that as you work in the nonprofit sector, you are supposed to be as poor or as needy or as financially vulnerable as the people you're serving? It's a stereotype. It's this stereotype that I'm seeing from old school philanthropy that doesn't work anymore, right? You can't expect people who are in the trenches doing this work, frontline workers, to be struggling financially to the point where they also can qualify for social services.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm realizing there's a thought process, sometimes an unspoken thought process, that if folks are in this industry, they're supposed to be suffering just as bad as the folks that they're serving. Right. And we have to move beyond this old school thinking about philanthropy. This is tough work.
It is.
This idea about what nonprofit folks should be struggling with to be taken seriously in this work is just, I think it's wrong. So I just wanted to say that because I was thinking about it. I've heard, and it came from a funder that I heard say it. Wow. And I was like, ugh, okay. That's something we're going to have to work on.
Well, I do think that there is a shift happening in philanthropy in terms of what do we even understand the nonprofit sector to be.
Yeah.
So as we hear this call for, a fair minimum wage, and we look at moving people beyond surviving to thriving.
Yes.
What does that look like in the nonprofit sector? It has to look like fair wages, and not just that people are, enough to just get by.
Yeah.
But enough to truly fulfill their full potential. And you just can't, to your point around, people being able to give from an empty well. The well is oftentimes that leader.
Yeah.
They're pouring out of themselves, their experience, oftentimes their own pockets, and their own reserves, if they even have reserves.
That's right.
Back into the organization. And so what does, I think we have to have a conversation, not just about like these individual leaders, but we have to have a conversation about the sector overall. What is fair compensation?
Yeah.
What should people receive as wages for work performed? And it shouldn't matter if you're in the private sector or the, nonprofit sector. Fair is fair.
Fair is fair, and the bills
Justice
are
just.
The bills regardless, right?
Yeah,
what it costs to live is not what it was.
But it's a shift in the nonprofit sector in terms of it becoming even a more professionalized industry. You have to think like so many nonprofits, if you go back even probably 25 years or 50, they're volunteer run organizations.
That's right.
And so as we've seen more nonprofits becoming more responsible for providing services in communities and getting government contracts and others, that's no longer how most nonprofits are run. There's not volunteer leadership and the work being done by a volunteer board.
That's a really good point.
They're staffed agencies. And so I think our thinking overall, again, has to shift along with that these aren't volunteers.
That's right.
These are professionals who have, and the industry has become more professionalized. So you have people who have gone to school, or sometimes they just have a lot of lived experience that is valuable, that are then delivering services that are actually eligible for reimbursement.
Yeah.
And the rates at which those services are being reimbursed at should be a fair and equitable wage.
Absolutely.
So I do think that, again, if you maybe grew up in a philanthropy where the majority of people who were coming to you, they didn't have overhead. They didn't have, a paid executive director. They just had a group of volunteers who got together and said, so it feels, it's unfamiliar to you, this idea of fair and equitable compensation in the sector. But I do believe we have more people who are actually coming out of the sector, coming into philanthropy, who are now bringing with them the experience of having to run an organization with paid leadership and paid staff. And so I think that's beginning to shift the way that people are engaging with leaders around what they pay themselves and what they pay their teams.
Well, that's a great segue into how did you end up at the foundation? Where were you and what were you doing? First of all, how did you get from Fairmont, West Virginia to Pittsburgh? And then how did your trajectory lead you to being a senior? I mean, I've watched as you've elevated in your role at the Pittsburgh Foundation. So how did you get there?
I'm going to try to tell the short story, Tammy. I'm going to try. I'm going to try to tell a short story. So ultimately, my mother decided that I could not stay in West Virginia. I think she saw possibilities and potential for my life that she did not believe that I would be able to actualize in my hometown. And so even though, my senior year of high school, she was going through chemotherapy treatments and radiation, and I wanted to stay home, she said,
nope.
She said, Shell, you have to go.
My goodness, what a woman.
And so I did, but I couldn't go too far from home. And so I was like, well, I'll apply to the University of Pittsburgh.
Wow.
Because I knew it was close enough that I could get home on a bus, or she could drive here, and I could be there if she needed me. And I thought I was going to come to school and I was going to become a neuropsychiatrist. I wanted to be part of whatever that group was going to be that was going to discover a cure for Alzheimer's disease.
Wow.
Because it was so unfamiliar to me. People in my family live a very long time.
Yes.
And I can't remember a single case growing up of an elder in my family having
Who had Alzheimer's. Yeah.
No one. Even today, I can't think of a senior member of my family. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. I wanted to learn more about it. But I got to school and I took a class, abnormal psychology. And I started learning about, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and other things. And I remember going home on, maybe it was Thanksgiving break, and I started having this conversation with my mom. And she was like, oh, well, your grandmother had bipolar disorder.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, excuse me?
What?
I didn't know it.
Yeah.
It had never been talked about, like many Black
We
families.
didn't talk about that.
Didn't talk about it.
No.
And she started telling me these stories of my grandmother's illness, her life. And as I started replaying my own experiences with her, I was like, oh, I can begin to see where this is showing up in our relationships and in our lives, but no one ever talked about it. And of course, it was stigma.
Yes.
In rural, Fayette County, we don't talk about those things. And so I switched my major, and I decided that I was going to pursue social work because I wanted to not only deal with the therapy, the mental health side of it, but also all of the psychosocial, things that are happening in people's lives and their families that also support people being well.
Yes.
Getting the supports and services
or the
that they
stuff
need.
they don't do so people don't get well. Yeah.
And so I decided that was going to be my thing. So fast forward, I was going to do clinical work and I was going to become part of this wave of new Black therapists because
we didn't have
them.
Right.
And I feel like if my grandmother and my family had access to culturally competent mental health care, maybe she would not have died early in her 60s from cancer that had metastasized that nobody caught because they weren't listening to her.
Yes.
And so I was like, oh, more families need more culturally relevant care. And I did that for a while. But the more time I spent with people, the more time I realized it's the systems.
The system is broken.
It's the systems. People don't have access to high quality, insurance that they can go wherever the services are that they need to get access at an affordable cost. Or there's not enough training of clinicians around what it means to be a culturally competent, therapist, or the resources. People are actually probably would do okay in community-based settings, but in their communities, they don't have access to spaces that are safe for them to be in. They are experiencing food insecurity. They don't have affordable housing. All of these stressors create an environment in which it's really hard to be mentally well.
And what's really interesting about that is I'm listening to you talk from my own experiences and from the experiences of working with folks in extreme poverty. Like it becomes hard to differentiate between, am I just stressed out because everything in my life is stressful, attaining every basic need is stressful, and so I just feel always on edge and always anxious and always depressed and always, it's got to be because I'm poor, not because there is a real undiagnosed mental health disorder that could be treated that could help improve some of these things, right? But I've suffered from depression and anxiety for as long as I can remember, but I never attributed it to, I never attributed the feelings because I didn't have language for it. I never attributed those symptoms, those feelings with a potential mental health diagnosis. It just had to be because life is hard. This stuff is hard. I'm overwhelmed. It's a lot to take on. Never even thought to talk to a doctor and say, is there something happening? Is there something wrong, right, with me? Is there something that can be treated? Is there something that I can get help for? I just said it's just probably because I feel these things because life is hard.
I think that's a lot of people. I think that's why in many cases when we talk to people, particularly in low income or Black communities, it's 6 months, a year, 2 years before they decide to seek treatment or receive a formal diagnosis if they receive one, because what is the difference between stress and depression?
Yes.
And we don't have language and we don't talk about those things. I would also say though, that we probably are seeing people who are witnessing signs and symptoms of what might be depression or anxiety, your doctor, who perhaps sometimes because of how you present or what you look like or the language that you use, don't assess you for those things.
Yeah.
Like we know that, Black youth are more likely to be diagnosed with a behavioral disorder than they are with depression or anxiety.
That was me. I was that kid, right? So I've just found out at 54 years old that I have ADHD. And then as I start thinking backwards, like, oh my God, that's why high school was so hard for me. That's why I struggled in school, to get assignments in on time. I knew the work. I just had a real tester. I'm a terrible tester, right? And nobody said, oh, maybe. It just was like, well, you're not trying hard enough and you just need to focus. And well, you're just not interested in learning, and it does something to you as an individual. Like, wow, maybe it is just me.
Yep.
Yeah. That's unfortunate. So then what happened?
Well, so then I was like, well, I'm going to go work at a mental health advocacy organization because we can talk about things like mental health parity in insurance coverage, and we can talk about the school to prison pipeline for youth who have mental health disorders, and we can talk about expunging records for people who have mental health diagnoses who for some reason or another ended up in the criminal justice system instead of the mental health care system. And then there was a budget crisis. Or there was a budget impasse. And during that time, the all mental health, all social services were going to receive some sort of a cut, but the steepest line was to the mental health line.
Wow.
It was projected to be 20 to 30%. And of course, that was going to trickle down from the state.
Oh, absolutely.
To the county, and then to the providers. And we were, as an agency, the agency I ran was 80% funded by county dollars.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, follow the money. We tell people, one of the ways we tell people what is important is by where we put our dollars.
100%. 100%.
And there's so many places where we can draw a line between how people are doing and where the dollars were invested or not.
Or not.
And in that case, I was like, oh, I want to start talking about the money. And that led me to the Pittsburgh Foundation.
Wow. My
program officer there, Kevin Jenkins, wonderful, wonderful example of what it looks like to do good philanthropy, be a good program officer. And I went to talk to him and I was like, I need to figure out how to get on this side. And he was like, well, I'm getting a promotion to this other position and my job opened up.
Be open. Look at that.
He was like, so you should consider applying. And I did. And I'm not going to cut myself short and say, I don't know why I was hired, but I'm still surprised. Because to your point, there are not a lot of people at that time who look like me in the field. And it has, though, been one of the most rewarding experiences that I've had because we can change resource flows. We can look at where dollars are going and say, what do we value? Who and what is important? And then how do we demonstrate that with the dollars that we have to put out into the community? And being at the Pittsburgh Foundation has allowed me to see what it could look like when you align your resources with your values.
And the programs that you created, right? So I remember first meeting you when I was a consultant for Circles Greater Pittsburgh. And I remember you.
That was so long ago.
It was so long ago, right? It was like a decade ago. It's insane. But I remember you distinctly because first I remember being so happy that you were a Black woman. And I was just in awe of you. Like, oh my God, she's here. What are we going to do? She's here. I hope she loves us, right? But there was just something about you and you were very no nonsense. Like, I'm not messing around. Like, is this social justice? Like, what's going on? What y'all? And I loved it because I had not seen or heard that. And I was very new, right? Very new to this space. And I just was like, oh man, she's amazing. And then I learned of the Small and Mighty grants. And tell us about, because that started at the Pittsburgh Foundation because that is a program that you developed and that you introduced to the foundation. So tell us about why that fund and what was it like convincing folks that this is something that needed to happen?
Yeah. So I told you I came into philanthropy because I wanted to look at where the dollars were going. And I had some ideas, but you don't know until you can get in and actually see. And so it actually started because I was learning about racial equity in philanthropy. I was learning about equity in philanthropy. And one of the things that they encouraged, the Initiative for Racial Equity in Philanthropy, one of the things that they encouraged was looking at your data. And so I didn't have the capacity to look at all of the data of the Pittsburgh Foundation, but I could look at mine. And what I found in my data was that at the time, this was after being there for just a year, that when I looked at where the dollars were going or who the dollars were going to, I found that only 16% of the grants and 14% of the grant dollars were going to organizations with budgets under $600,000. And why is that important? Because 2/3 of the nonprofit sector, about 66% of all nonprofits, have budgets under $500,000. So our funding to that particular demographic of organizations, small nonprofits, didn't reflect the landscape of nonprofits in the region.
Yeah.
And then when we looked at organizations by just executive director leadership, what was the race of the person who was leading the organization, we found that only 11% of grants and 9% of grant dollars went to those organizations. And so one way that philanthropy might ask the question of what's wrong is what's wrong with the organizations?
Yes.
So what are they doing wrong?
What are they doing wrong? Where are they deficient? What are they not doing?
What are they not doing?
Yeah.
But the other question could be, what are we doing as an organization that's keeping them out? What are we doing that makes it difficult to access the dollars? Now, I didn't have the answer to that question. I remember being a small nonprofit leader. I remember the rejection letters. I remember not feeling like I was good enough, that I was doing something wrong. But I figured, well, let's just go talk to some nonprofit leaders who run small organizations. And we partnered with Program to Aid Citizen Enterprise, PACE, and we looked at our own grantees, people that we had funded, also people we hadn't funded. And we just asked, like, what does philanthropy do that makes it hard for you all to access dollars? And we were asking both about the Pittsburgh Foundation, but just philanthropy generally.
In general, yeah.
And they were like, well, you don't, basically they're saying you don't value us. That, the only way to get money in philanthropy is if you know somebody. You have to have relationships. People have to like you. People have to know you. Foundations think that if you're small, then that means you're ineffective, or you're not a well-run organization.
You're not running a valuable impact. Your impact's not valuable because it's not big enough.
Not big enough.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh. And they're like, you don't trust us to do the work. And we're like, well, what can we change about us? And they started giving us suggestions of things that we could change about our application process, things we could change about how accessible we are, things we could change about how our criteria is written, about the kind of things that we support and fund. And out of all of that feedback, Small and Mighty was birthed. That we changed our decision timeline. Instead of having to wait 6 months to get a decision, 60-day turnaround from application to decision. The application was too lengthy. You're asking things that we start looking, we're like, oh, we're asking about things that don't actually factor into the decision.
Yeah.
We can remove those from the application. We could streamline it. We could start doing information sessions so that we could actually provide information about what we were looking for. We could do office hours and one-on-one engagements with organizations to give them feedback or to help them think through their proposals or help them write their proposal if that was what they needed. Because who speaks philanthropies as a language? Most of us do not.
Right.
I certainly didn't.
Yeah.
And so Small and Mighty was birthed out of listening.
And let me tell you what else. So I don't know if you know that you're famous for a quote that you made in an information session. You were speaking to the group and you said something that people have not forgotten that you said. And do you remember? You know what it was?
I'm a little scared.
No, I remember people saying, Michelle called it, there will be no poverty pimping happening here. And you saying that, I don't even know if you know how important it was that you said that out loud and that you said it, because I don't think anybody else at the foundation would have said that out loud, right? It might have been an internal conversation, but the fact that you said it out loud in a room full of people, some of which are guilty, and others that have been wanting to say that for so long, I remember feeling like somebody gets it. Somebody gets it. That a lot, that, here's the reality. We live in a city where there's more philanthropic dollars circulating than any other city in this country. Probably.
Well, per capita, yeah.
Right? We still have some of the worst statistics around poverty and around vulnerable populations of people. And that doesn't sit well with me. And so I know that Allegheny County has a humongous amount of nonprofit organizations. Uh, some that are doing some incredible work in our communities. And just being honest, some that have learned that we're in a sector that it's kind of easy to extort the most vulnerable population of people for the purposes of making money, right? And we know that poverty is profitable. And there are a lot of people who have learned how to make a profit off of the backs and struggle of some of the most vulnerable people in the city. And we all talk about it amongst ourselves, right? To hear you say that meant that you saw it and you saw us. And I've never forgotten that, because it's a term that I had used and have used for years because it's happening. It's the American way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, and I would say for, our team at the foundation, it's very hard to understand how you can help people if you cannot see the value in those people.
Absolutely.
And so what we noticed, and we don't think it was done out of harm, it's the game.
It's because the deficiency languages, right? We got to make the communities that we're serving sound as downtrodden and like there's no hope for them without me and these dollars.
And so if that's the competition that you feel like you're in, who can tell the worst story about the people that we're serving to demonstrate that they have the greatest need?
Yeah.
As opposed to, there's so much value here. And that's one of the things that we changed in the application for Small and Mighty is tell us about the strengths of the people that you serve and the assets in the community that you're working in.
And how can we help amplify that? Right? It's because there is no one nonprofit organization that can solve these issues. I say that all the time. We as nonprofit folk cannot solve these issues. We can support families, we can support families as they navigate. We can inspire and motivate families to continue to fight and to move towards economic stability, but we cannot solve the overall issue of poverty. And we can't solve it for people in our community. We can't solve it for people across America, but we all can do a little bit and do the pieces that we can do ethically with integrity and omitting that need to focus on a community's deficiencies. So I just wanted you to know that you're famous for that.
I appreciate it,
but
people
still talk about it, and because it was powerful that you said it out loud.
Well, philanthropy has a role in creating that phenomenon, right? Like I feel like systems teach you how to be successful at the game. So if what people have witnessed is that philanthropy is rewarding the people who are able to tell the worst stories, if development officers, move from organization to organization and have learned that when you apply to X Foundation, here's how you get the dollars, then it's also the onus is on philanthropy. We can't just say like, oh, stop telling those awful, very biased, very detrimental stories.
But let me help you reshape and reframe
how do we take our role in that, right? To say, I understand that this is what you've learned, because that's what I had learned. I didn't want my data to look the way that it looked. But I had learned that there was a way that you evaluated organizations. There was a way you evaluated and did the due diligence process for an application that resulted in that outcome. So I have to have grace, and I have to give grace, and I have to have empathy for the fact that you've learned something and you just have to unlearn it. Yeah. And so, but we have a role in that because if we keep rewarding it, but now we can reward who can tell us the best story about the community that they serve.
And how is our investment going to help you do more of that? Yes.
We just have to shift that. And so for me, that's what this work is. My work at the foundation, the work that we're trying to do at the foundation has been about is trying to shift the culture of philanthropy. Because we have the power to do good, but we also have the power to do an immense amount of harm by our own practices, our own policies, our own messages out into the sector. And people respond because we have power.
They do, yes. And you are very humble, right? You've always been very humble. But I think it's important for you to acknowledge that a lot of the advances and changes in how the Pittsburgh Foundation does philanthropy has come from your work, has come from the influence that you've had at the foundation. So we got to acknowledge that.
I understand the role that I play,
yes,
and the part that I play. But to your point about the nonprofit sector, no one organization can create the kind of sea change that we need.
Yeah,
it can't just be one person
That's
either.
Right.
And so I play my role. I understand my position. I understand my influence, but I also have the privilege of working with people who also bring their lived experience to philanthropy. And that's across the organization.
Yeah, and it's easy to see it too.
Without that willingness, without that desire, without the humility and vulnerability across, the team to recognize like, oh, we want to do some good things, but we also have to turn the mirror inward. Joyce James, one of my favorite, DEI consultants, she says like, you have to be critical lovers of your systems and institutions. We work in them. She says we built the house, we live in the house. We didn't build it, but we live in it. And if you can't look and see that your roof is leaky and
the floorboards
are coming up and the walls, the paint is peeling on the walls, and you're not willing to take responsibility for that solely because you didn't construct the house, maybe you shouldn't live here.
That is an incredible analogy. I love that.
And so that's I think the ethos of our team is the willingness to turn the mirror inward and say, how can we be critical lovers of this system and institution today? We work in it.
Yeah.
I believe that there's good that can be done from this post.
Yeah.
But not if we're unwilling to look internally and say, what is our role in the harm? And what are we willing to do about it?
And the Pittsburgh Foundation really has been a leader in helping people move towards trust-based philanthropy. I really think that the Pittsburgh Foundation has been a leader in that conversation. And some of the other foundations have taken a page out of the Pittsburgh Foundation book. They still got some work to do, but I think
so do we.
Right? Everybody has work to do. But where I really, really saw this and where it really came in handy was during the pandemic. And another initiative that you had a hand in, the Social Justice Fund. And I remember that we were having a really tough time, not financially, but emotionally and psychologically. There was a lot happening all at once. The pandemic, we saw the inequities that were happening and trying to assist families to survive the pandemic. We really saw just the ugliness of this country during the George Floyd. It was just so much happening all at once. And I remember the Pittsburgh Foundation taking a leadership role in pulling all your Black-led organizations together and being very intentional about making sure we were okay. And I remember that Zoom, right? We were all new to Zoom, but we were on this Zoom. Do you remember that?
I do.
We were on this Zoom and we were all feeling it that day. And it was just so beautiful that you guys gave us a space to really just let it loose and just to feel like we were in this safe environment where we could talk about not only what was happening with our organizations, because a lot of our organizations were having a tough time. The people we were serving having a tough time. The country as a whole having a tough time, but Black people in general really having a tough time. And Black people leading organizations and movements during that time were exhausted. And it just felt like a hug, right? It felt like somebody cared enough to say, are you okay? Not your organization, not your work, but are you okay? And do you guys need anything? And that, honestly, that gave me another burst of energy that we really needed because we had been working nonstop. We were working from home, weren't used to working from home yet. And I remember just working from the time I woke up until I got sleepy. Right? There
I
was
still remember what you said that day.
Yeah,
you remember what you said?
I don't. I was a mess that day.
I remember you said that you felt like you were sitting in a foxhole with your laptop.
Yes.
And the imagery from that, I mean, I think it resonated with everybody.
Yeah, that was exactly what I felt like. We were at war, and I felt like the war was happening all around us. The bullets were flying, and we still had to keep going. And it was tough. It was really, really hard. And I will say that moment, that day that you guys called that meeting, that was some fuel. I really needed that. That was some of the hardest part of this work for me, is knowing that, we could only do so much, and there was so much suffering. There's still suffering happening from 5 years ago. And I've been having a little bit of PTSD because I'm feeling like we're headed to that place again. Those were, just that space that was provided was special, and it was unique to the Pittsburgh Foundation.
Well, I mean, I think that, we start off saying, like, what is philanthropy? It is love of humanity.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that in this time that we're in, for philanthropy to be effective moving forward, we will have to embrace a definition of philanthropy that goes beyond dollars.
Absolutely. And equity. I think that's another word that needs some fine tuning. I don't think everybody's clear. I'm going to ask you, what is your definition of equity?
I mean, at its baseline, I think that it's that resources follow need. Like, what I need as a Black, woman with, a master's degree and a job that provides, paid family leave is not the same as what, a colleague I'm sitting next to who does not experience the academic privilege or the social privilege of working for a foundation or the financial privileges that come along with having a wide array of benefits that support your complete well-being.
Yeah.
I don't need the same thing. It doesn't mean I don't need anything.
But the things you need are different.
But the things I need are different. And it would be wrong for me to receive the same thing that this person over here is receiving solely so that we can say that it's fair.
Yeah.
When I don't need it.
Yeah.
Or I don't need as much of it.
That's right.
And so the resources should follow the need. If I don't need it, then I shouldn't have it. And
not only should you not have it, you shouldn't try to keep other people from getting it. Yeah. And I think that's the struggle, I'm convinced that I'm getting off of social media. Well, I'm convinced I can't take it anymore because I see these types of arguments, right? Well, you should have worked harder, and you should have managed your money better, and you should have gotten better. It's like all the you shouldas that people, it's like, why should you get this? I worked hard for this. Why should they get the same thing I have? Mentality is really detrimental to our country, to our communities, to our families, to this idea of collective community, right? Does that even exist anymore? Does it exist where, we talked about the community, and I know these things happen at a grassroots level. I know they do. I know that I see it all the time, neighbors supporting neighbors, and usually during the toughest times. And what I do see is the people with the least being the first to step up, willing to give. Yeah. And I'm trying to figure out what do we have to do to convince people that we are better when we are collectively and collaboratively doing this work of philanthropy. We're doing this work of supporting each other as a community. What do you think we need to do to either highlight the work that is being done to do that, or to encourage people to do more of that community, collective, we're going to take care of each other kind of thing? How do we get people back to that?
Oh, Tammy. I mean, I don't know that I have the answer, but for me, it has come down to being intentional about relationship. Mm-hmm. So there's a model that I love that's called the Waters of Systems Change. Mm. And it's like this inverted pyramid. And at the top are policies, practices, and resource flows. So if you think of it as like an iceberg, that's the thing that you can see. Mm-hmm. You can touch, taste, smell, those things. But underneath of that, the things that actually support that change are relationships and mental models. Mm. So for me, we have to change the way that we think about our relationship, like one another, and we have to change the relationships that we have to one another. How we do that? I mean, I can only use the example of, you know, the Pittsburgh Foundation. You've been talking about the work that we've been doing to like shift our own practice. Most of that has been done by shifting our mental models and our relationships. We've shifted the way that we engage with people, not as, you know, haves and have-nots, or, you know, funders and beneficiaries. But I'm only sitting here with you today
because we have a relationship. Yes.
And one that is rooted in me being able to see and honor your humanity, not the value of how many programs can Tammy produce, which has been a lot, actually. And how many, you know, people, you know, can she serve? And that becomes your value. But the value is, who are you? What do you believe? Why do you do what you do? Why is this so important to you? The fact that you are willing to share things about how you're feeling. If I ask you how you're doing on a given day, you know,
it's a mess. You out here.
But I'm legitimately asking.
I know, and that's why I can authentically see. And so when we talk about relationships, there's two types of relationships. There's several types of relationships. There's just a relationship. Then there's an authentic relationship. And the authentic relationships are a lot more difficult to have because they require you to be vulnerable.
They also take time.
They take time, and they require you to take off that mask, right? Because especially as Black women, we do, oh yeah, I'm blessed. As soon as somebody asks you how you're doing, I'm blessed. Yes, you are, but what else is happening?
Yeah.
How are you really feeling? And do I feel safe enough when you ask me that? Do I feel safe enough to be honest about how I'm feeling? That takes time to get to, but you know, I try to be authentic in these relationships. And when somebody I respect asks me how I'm doing, I feel safe enough to be honest about that. And that took a time, though. It took a long time to get to that for me. And I think that's happening with a lot of us, is that we're not being honest about what's really going on. And then it makes it very challenging to build community with folks that don't feel safe enough to be authentic, because I, for one, can't be in relationships that are not authentic. I'm too much of an empath. I feel everything. I'm an energy magnet, and I can instantly tell when it's not real. So that's a challenge for me in this city. I'll be honest. It's a challenge. So when I find those relationships that I know and I can feel the authenticity in them, I'm a lot less likely to hold back.
Yeah.
And so I try to be that for other people, because I know that in order for us to build the types of coalitions that we need to build to really move the needle, we've got to be authentic with each other. We've got to be real. We've got to be able to honestly and authentically resolve conflict. We've got to be able to be real about you're stronger here than you are there. Let's help you focus on the places that your strength lies.
Yeah.
Right? You don't have to do everything. You shouldn't be trying to do some of the stuff that you're doing. I think as a community, we need more of that. And some days I feel like it's going to be a lot harder than I wish it were.
But it is happening.
It's happening, right? I see it happening, and I'm like, we need to happen faster, people.
It is happening, and I think that it's that when people see that it's possible, that there's another way of being that exists. Like, it's possible to not be in competition.
Yes.
It's possible to see somebody who is doing what you're doing
and collaborate. How can we do it together?
Find ways to do it together. And I think the more we highlight and spotlight where that's happening, the more it can happen.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine, we were talking, it's this history that just gets pulled forward. And I think about the role that philanthropy, quite frankly, plays in some of these dynamics of competition among, we talk about the nonprofit Hunger Games, that, there's a role also that philanthropy has played in creating the conditions of competition by picking winners and losers, as opposed to seeing the value, and there can be more than one of.
Yes.
And because simply the community said that there should be. If there's 50 people going here and 50 people going here, maybe it's not our job to say all 100 people should go here.
Exactly. Because
by not funding this and funding this,
you're creating this environment of competition, right? Absolutely.
And so people respond to that, and so they're like, oh, well, I actually can't collaborate with you, because if they see your name on the application and then my name on your application, they'll only fund one of us, or they won't fund either of us, because they'll think we're double dipping.
I've actually experienced that multiple times. So you're right.
Yeah.
Wow. I just feel very blessed to have a relationship with you, but also I've learned so much from you and from the foundation. I've worked with multiple program officers. I've had an opportunity to work in space with you guys, and it has been a unique experience. I have to say, it's a unique experience that I would love to have with some of the other foundations in some way. But it's been truly valuable to me as a new leader in this space, and as someone who I really feel like an infant in this space. I really do.
Me too.
I'm still learning so much every day, that having philanthropic partners to be part of that education has been very valuable to me and to our organization, and then ultimately to the people that we serve.
Well, I just want to return that, because I've been in philanthropy a decade now. And the thing that I think allows me to keep doing this work is the understanding that I don't have all the answers. And I don't know everything, but I know something. And if I combine the something I know with the something you know, with the something that, other partners know, like collectively, we can get to a new space, a different space, a future where our individual and collective humanity is honored and supported, and our dreams are possible, and we can thrive. But it starts with just relationship
and conversation.
Like this.
Oh man, thank you so much for coming to sit and have this conversation. I feel like we could have this conversation all day. There's so much to talk about. But thank you.
No, thank you.
Listen, that was an incredible first episode to our new season. If you have not subscribed, what are you waiting for? If you're not following us, what are you waiting for? We have a lot of incredible conversations scheduled for this season, and you do not want to miss any of it. So I'll see you back here for the next episode of the Lily Pod.